We're going over strength programming for climbing today. So I'll just introduce myself to start. My name is Juliet Hammer. I work with climbers of all different levels to help them achieve their goals. My bachelor's degree is in biology. I'm a certified strength and conditioning specialist and a certified precision nutrition coach. As far as climbing goes, I've been climbing since 2005, so 15 years. Time flies. I've done some competitions in the past, some notable results. I got second place in the 2014 Collegiate Climbing Nationals, 11th place in the 2017 Open Sport Climbing Nationals, and then I primarily boulder outside now, and I've bouldered up to V11 with 30 ascents, V10 and up. So just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to go over the bioenergetics of training. Then we're going to be talking about primary training goals. We'll go through periodization and then specifically strength programming for climbing. And then at the end, we can do a little question and answer. So if you want to type in the chat box, any questions that come up as we're going through, we'll kind of circle back around at the end. All right, so first we're going to talk bioenergetics of training. So first, let's define the word bioenergetics. So basically this means the conversion of chemical energy. So this can come from macronutrients or compounds we already have in our body and converting that energy into biologically usable forms of energy. So if you've ever taken a biology class, I'm sure you've heard of ATP. So ATP is this usable form of energy. So when we're converting that chemical energy, we're making ATP. And ATP is what we use when we're contracting our muscles. So whenever we do any exercise, whenever we contract our muscles, we are actively using ATP. And we have 3 different energy systems we use to produce ATP. And we're going to go through each of those in more detail, but just an overview, we have the phosphagen system, which uses creatine phosphate for converting this chemical energy into ATP. We have the glycolytic energy system, which uses carbohydrates to produce ATP. And then we have the oxidative system, which see if I can move this. No. Okay. Which uses carbohydrates, fat, and sometimes protein. Protein being when we are in more of like a starvation mode. It doesn't happen super often. I want my side thing to go away. Oh well. Sorry. Let me get this sidebar out. Okay. So first we'll go over the phosphagen system. So again, yep, this is the creation of ATP from a reaction with creatine phosphate. So basically, we have ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, so 3 phosphates. And so when we react with adenosine diphosphate, we can basically take a phosphate from that creatine phosphate, add it on, make ATP, this is kind of why we see people supplementing with creatine sometimes, and that's just to increase the availability of this creatine phosphate for this energy system specifically. This system is going to be present at the start of all activity, no matter the intensity. So if you're just going on a walk, if you're going on a run, if you're climbing, everything starts with this phosphagen system. And it's going to provide energy for short-term, high-intensity activities. It's basically active from 0 to 10 seconds in exercise, and it's able to create ATP pretty quickly, but then it's going to run out pretty quickly. So we use it for these shorter-term activities, which is going to be like resistance training, doing sprints. For climbing, it's going to be the campus board. Anything that's kind of that maximal effort or max hangs, if you're doing a max hang for like 7 or 10 seconds, that's going to be this phosphagen system. Anything that's, again, yeah, kind of that maximal effort kind of activity. Next, we're going to talk about the glycolytic system. So this is the creation of ATP from the breakdown of carbohydrate. There's kind of 2 different kinds of glycolysis. The difference isn't super important, but basically fast glycolysis, the end product is used directly to make ATP, and this takes place anaerobically, which means without oxygen. And then there's also slow glycolysis, so that's the end product is used. It doesn't make ATP directly, but it's shuttled into this oxidative system, which is what we're going to talk about next, and that is going to require oxygen. And this system is used for activities that are going to be in this 10 seconds to about 2-minute range. So climbing wise, we're thinking about maybe a longer boulder, something we would maybe consider more of a power endurance boulder, a longer duration hang. So if you're doing like 30-second hangs, that kind of thing, or higher intensity repeaters where you're kind of on and off for between that 10 to 120 seconds. So I know a lot of repeater protocols, you're kind of on and off for a minute before you take a rest. So that would be recruiting this glycolytic system. And then lastly, we have the oxidative system. So this one is going to break down carbohydrate and fat. It's going to start with carbohydrates. We're going to use all of that stored glucose we have. It's called glycogen. We're going to use all the glycogen we have available in our muscle, which isn't a ton. Then we're going to go through the glycogen that's stored in our liver. And then once that's kind of depleted, it starts running off of fat. And again, sometimes protein is really going to only be in cases of kind of more of a starvation. So we're not going to see that as often. It's the primary source of energy during these lower intensity, longer duration, steady state activities. So when I say steady state, this means like a pretty repetitive motion over and over and over. So this is going to be like running. This is going to be like biking for those longer durations. Climbing wise, I would call it more like if you were on a tread wall, just kind of going at a pretty steady pace. Yeah, nothing jumping out. There's no like significant crux or anything like that. You're just going pretty steady. It could be like this maybe on a big wall, or if you're hiking, doing kind of those more mountaineering type activities. So when we are talking about training, we want to make sure that we're being metabolically specific, and that is being specific to the bioenergetics. So we can see here at this table, we're going to look at the duration of the event, the intensity of the event, and the primary energy system that we use. So again, kind of in this 0 to 6 seconds, we have a very extremely high intensity, and it's going to be this phosphagen system. And the intensity that we're able to maintain for 6 seconds is not going to be sustainable for much longer. So after the 6 seconds into this 30-second range, we're still at a pretty high intensity. We're using phosphagen and then also breaking into this glycolysis. Then from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, still pretty high intensity. We're all glycolysis now. 2 to 3 minutes, we're shifting over. We're at moderate intensity, and we're shifting over to the oxidative system. And then greater than 3 minutes, we're at a lower intensity and we're using this oxidative system. So again, just thinking about the kind of intensity we can maintain for more than 3 minutes versus the type of intensity that you can have from 0 to 6 seconds. And so that's why we have these different energy systems, just with how much ATP we have available, how quickly they make the ATP, and how long you need them to make the ATP for. So we're going to talk about this more specifically with climbing towards the end when we talk about programming for climbing, but just keep this in mind. Think about kind of where you are in this with your climbing, whether you're, trying a really short boulder, you might be in this 0 to 30 seconds. If you're kind of doing a longer boulder or sport climbing, just, yeah, think about where you're at within this table. So now we're going to talk about resistance training with regards to climbing. So we have 3 primary training outcomes that we can get from resistance training, and that's going to be endurance, hypertrophy, and strength. So again, we're going to just run through all of those and define them. So first is going to be endurance, which is going to be this low level force expression over an extended amount of time. So it's literally like how long can I contract my muscle at this lower intensity. We're using the oxidative system with this. And again, it's going to be kind of more of these steady state exercises in this 2 to 3 minutes or more. And now we're going to talk about different muscle types. So endurance specifically trains this type 1 or slow twitch muscle because of these different energy systems, we have different muscles that are equipped for that metabolic pathway specifically. So these type 1 muscles are equipped for the oxidative system, and they have, different makeup than type 2 muscles. Next, we're going to talk about hypertrophy. So the outcome of hypertrophy is an increase in muscle fiber cross-sectional area, and that's in order to increase the amount of muscle that's available to exert force. So it's basically like if you have the amount of muscle that you have, you feel like you're pretty strong, but you're just not exerting as much force as you want to be, the next step would be to maybe put on some muscle, and that's where you would go into this hypertrophy training goal. This is going to use the glycolytic anaerobic energy system, and it's going to be these type 2 muscles. So again, these fast twitch muscles, they're equipped for glycolysis or the phosphagen system to handle things without oxygen. And these kind of exercises that we use for hypertrophy are going to typically be a little bit more of isolated movements, and you're kind of going for that pumped feeling with hypertrophy. So an example of an isolated movement is going to be like a bicep curl. So you're literally working the one muscle, which is just the bicep. And if you're doing it on a hypertrophy protocol, you're probably doing, a moderate number of reps, not really letting yourself recover, having a shorter rest period, and then going again and just trying to get that pumped feeling, which we typically are mostly familiar with in our forearms. So if you are newer to climbing, or you remember when you started climbing, there is potential that you saw your forearms get a little bigger, because this is kind of the type of thing we do with climbing, is more like a hypertrophy type action. All right, and then lastly, we'll talk about strength. So strength is all about maximizing the force expression of your current muscle. And so your neuromuscular system is going to have a lot to do with this. So we know the neuromuscular system is the connection between your central nervous system, your brain, and your muscles. And basically what's happening is when you're doing an exercise, your brain is saying, okay, muscle, work. And the more that we train this strength adaptation, the better that kind of connection is going to be to the muscle. And that's where we get the thing called recruitment. So your brain is able to, your nerves are able to recruit more muscle fibers in the muscle that you already have. And so that's how you're going to be able to generate more force. And this is pretty common in untrained individuals. When you do start resistance training, this is the main adaptation that happens, is your brain just gets better at recruiting that muscle. And it's one of the reasons why we see such a big gain in people who just start lifting and strength training. Again, this is going to be the type 2 fast twitch muscles. And typically when we're training strength, we are training more compound movements. So versus the isolated movements of hypertrophy, which the example I gave was a bicep curl, a compound movement for strength would be, for example, a chin up. So that's going to recruit not only your bicep, it's going to also get your lat involved in there, and all the stabilizing shoulder muscles are all going to be involved. And the reason we use these more compound movements is you're always going to be able to generate more force with these compound movements. So the force that you can generate with just your bicep, you're probably only going to be able to lift, let's say 40 pounds or whatever, 50 pounds, versus when you get on a chin-up bar and you do a chin-up, you're probably able to do body weight, or maybe you're adding some weight. So overall, you're able to generate more force. And that's why we use these compound movements for strength. Okay, so now we'll just talk about this training goal and how we train to get there. So we'll start with just the reps and sets of things. So if we're training for this strength adaptation, of which power kind of falls under this strength goal. We're doing 6 or fewer reps, 2 to 6 sets. Power just kind of falls within that. And we're also, if we look over here, we're taking a pretty significant rest period. So we're resting for 2 to 5 minutes. And the goal of that is to allow full recovery of those energy systems, of that phosphagen and that glycolytic energy system. We're getting full recovery so that they're ready to go again when we go back for our next set. The training goal for hypertrophy, you're doing kind of this mid-level, moderate number of reps. So we're in the 6 to 12 range. You're doing 3 to 6 reps, but we can see that the rest period is going to go down quite a bit. So we're in this 30 seconds to 1.5 minute range. And this is to kind of prevent that full recovery. And that's when we get that pump, because again, we're trying to elicit a response that we want more muscle fibers. We want a greater cross-sectional area. So we're not quite letting things recover. And that's why you kind of feel pumped if you're doing a protocol like this. And then we have muscular endurance as the training goal. We're doing greater than 12 reps. We're doing 2 to 3 sets. And then we're resting for 30 seconds or less. And that's again so that we can not really let those phosphagen and glycolytic systems recover, and that way we stay in that oxidative state where we're eliciting that response. All right, so for periodization, first we're going to talk about the general adaptation syndrome. So this is just an overview of how training works. So on the left here, we have performance level, and then as we go from left to right, we're just talking about time here. So what we're looking at here is you kind of have this baseline performance level. This is where you're at. And this is where we introduce training. So your body's going to be like, whoa, what are we doing? This is different. And the first phase is going to be this alarm phase. So it's with this, when the stimulus is first recognized, and performance generally decreases in response to fatigue. So again, your body's not used to this. This is why you probably feel pretty sore. If you start training, you might feel fatigued. But as long as you're on a properly programmed protocol, you're next going to get this resistance phase. So this is where your body adapts to the stress that you've introduced, and the body is able to return to baseline. And in most instances, it's going to supersede where you were at previously. So now you're at this new baseline performance level. And if you were to continue introducing the new stressors, making sure you're progressing yourself, again, you're going to get this little dip, and then we're going to go back up and we're going to hit a new baseline. And I liked that they zoomed in over here because there are going to be intraday, interday, and microcycle fluctuations. So intraday is within a day. Interday is going to be, you know, oh, I did worse on Wednesday than I did on Monday. And then microcycle is going to be like a week, within a week. So we are all going to have this kind of up and down days, but overall the trend is going to be going up. So even if you have like a not great day, it's not a huge deal. It happens. And if you just continue, you'll hit a new baseline. And then lastly, we do have this kind of number 4 phase, which is called the overtraining phase, which is if your program isn't appropriately written and the stressors are too high, your body is just not going to be able to adapt or recover, and instead you're just going to see this decrease in performance level. So if your performance level goes well below where you think it should be, that could be a sign of overtraining. So just, you know, listening to your body, making sure things are progressing the way that they theoretically should, and just trying to avoid that overtraining. And we do this through periodization. So periodization is programming to peak your performance at specific time points. So we are training, and then we say, okay, this is the time I want to perform, and then preparing for that time. And so when we're talking about a period, it's literally any amount of time you want it to be. So starting At the top, a multi-year plan, this could be like if you were training for the Olympics or, you know, training for events that only happen every couple of years or a few years. But most of us, if anything, we might be doing an annual training plan where you can kind of look at your year and say, okay, I know conditions are really good in the fall, so I know I'm going to want to perform there. And then I'll probably take a little break in the winter and do some training. And then once spring season comes again, I'm ready to perform again. So kind of just zooming out, looking on more of a macro scale and seeing, okay, where do I want to perform? And so therefore, when do I need to be training? Macro cycle is kind of within that 1 year. Most of us are familiar with this mesocycle, which is going to be a 2 to 6 week duration. And this is sometimes referred to as a block of training. Most common duration we see is 4 weeks. And so, yeah, again, this is going to be kind of where you see most training plans. You're going to want to do at least 4 weeks, if not longer. And these are made up of microcycles, which is several days to 2 weeks. It's basically what you're doing within 1 week. And then, of course, we have the training day and the training session. So mostly when we're thinking about periodization and programming, we're usually thinking kind of in this mesocycle area and either zooming in a little bit or zooming out a little bit. So there's 3 types of periodization that we're going to talk about. The first one is going to be this linear periodization. So this is a very, very common protocol that we see, and I do think it is a bit outdated. That's just my opinion, but it is kind of what you see if you open any like personal training textbook. It's the pretty classic periodization. So what this is discrete blocks of endurance, hypertrophy, and then strength. And it usually goes in that order where we're starting at endurance, so high reps, low intensity, we're kind of transitioning into more moderate, and then we're ending with strength, which is going to be those low reps, high intensity. So example would be 4 weeks of endurance, 4 weeks of hypertrophy, and then 4 weeks of strength. So the pros of this is it could be beneficial to those with a young training age. When I think of this, I mostly think of more of like the general population. I'm thinking of someone who's maybe not as physically active and just needs to get started to like get familiar with the idea of movement because they can't handle anything more intense. So that's kind of who I would think of if I were to assign this to anyone. I think us as athletes and as climbers, we don't need to start with this endurance thing. We're pretty well equipped to kind of start with something a little bit more intense. I really wouldn't have a climber come to me and I'd be like, okay, let's do 20 squats. That's not really my training philosophy. And yeah, like I said, it's one method, and this is just my opinion. So take with that what you will. Some of the cons are going to be the time between training these different energy systems is going to be extended. So if you are in a strength phase, it's going to have been 8 weeks since you last trained endurance. So you're really not going to have that capacity anymore. Or similarly, if you're back at endurance and you finish endurance, you're not going to have trained strength for 4 weeks. So you kind of lose that capacity to kind of change between the different energy systems, and you're really kind of stuck with what you're currently training. It can definitely get monotonous. So again, with endurance, you're doing sets of 20 every week for 4 weeks, and then hypertrophy, you're doing sets of 12 for 4 weeks every week. So it can get a little bit boring for people. And then we're also building off of a base of endurance rather than strength, which can be problematic. So if we're starting at this lower intensity and then trying to drop into strength versus we know that endurance is more of that bioenergetic conditioning. So it's almost easier or better to start with strength as your foundation and then train specifically for a couple weeks to get that endurance back. But strength is definitely going to be a lot harder to build than endurance is. So I definitely am a proponent of starting with strength and building off of that strength. All right, the second one is going to be traditional periodization, which is basically you're doing the same sets and reps for a block of training. So let's just say you're doing 4 sets of 6 reps. But each time you do that workout, you're varying the intensity. So you're varying the amount of weight, and ultimately you're just increasing that intensity over time. So an example is you're doing a 4x6. On one day, you do it at 85% of your 1 rep max. The next day, you do it at 75%. Then the next day, you're doing it at 65%. And then you're kind of just cycling through and just trying to increase that weight a little bit over time. So the pros of this is it's going to be a lower volume protocol, which can be argued that there's less risk of injury. So again, if you're doing 4 sets of 6, you're doing 24 reps. And so that's a pretty low rep volume. And again, you're varying the intensity. So it's not quite as monotonous as the linear periodization. The cons are that there is potential for this neural fatigue caused by the increasing training intensity. So kind of what I was talking about with that neuromuscular connection. If you're doing 4 sets of 6 reps, your brain might get tired of recruiting those muscles for 4 sets of 6 reps over and over and over and over. So that is one potential takeaway. And then the last kind of periodization we'll talk about is this undulating periodization, or it's also known as nonlinear periodization. And this is just a constant fluctuation of load and volume. So we're changing the number of reps, we're changing the number of sets, and we're changing the intensity on a pretty consistent basis. So the pros of this is, again, that kind of absence of the accumulated neural fatigue. So we're, changing the stress. We're, doing sets of 10, and then we're doing sets of 4, and it just kind of prevents that neuromuscular system from fatiguing. You have that constant variation, so it's a little bit more interesting for those who are doing the protocol. And then we're also constantly training different energy systems. So if, 1 week we're doing a set of 10, we're kind of getting into that glycolysis energy system. And then let's say another week you're doing 2 reps, and that's going to be more of that phosphagen system. So we're always kind of dipping in and out of the different energy systems. We're asking for different things from our body. It just keeps it interesting and prevents, again, that neural fatigue. Some of the cons is that there is potential for greater peripheral fatigue. So that's going to be your muscles themselves. And it can be argued there's potential increased risk of energy from overall higher volume load. So again, with the traditional periodization, we're doing 4 sets of 6 reps, that's 24 reps, versus if we're doing 4 sets of 10, that's 40 reps. And that's overall just a higher volume load than the traditional one. But ultimately, studies have not shown any difference between this traditional versus the undulating models. So it's really up to you, and that's kind of the fun of programming, is you get to really just try different things out. You inform yourself as much as you can, and then, try and create a plan with that information. And it's all kind of experimentation, especially with climbing, because there really isn't any research because our sport is so young. So it's just a fun time programming is one of my favorite things to do, just because you can get a little creative with it and try different things. All right, so we're going to talk about programming for climbing specifically. So we're going to come on back to bioenergetics, which again is those energy systems. So you want the bioenergetics to be specific to your climbing goals. And I like to kind of think of training bioenergetics as something that you can really do specifically on the wall. So again, I wouldn't necessarily have someone do 20 reps of squats to break into that oxidative system. But obviously, if you're going climbing and you're training for this hard route that takes you 5 minutes, it could be worth doing that on the wall to train that energy system specifically, and specifically with climbing. And we always are going to start with that phosphagen system. We're going to go into glycolysis before we get to the oxidative system. So it's always worth training all of those, even if you are primarily just using, if you're like a sport climber and you feel like you're primarily on the wall for 3 minutes or longer, it's still worth training that phosphagen and glycolytic system, especially because they can kind of come in and out as we're on that. Especially, like I said, with something that's not so steady state. So if you're on a long route and you get a bomber knee bar and you're sitting there just shaking out, you're resting and you're recovering those phosphagen and glycolytic systems. And you're getting ready for maybe that next powerful sequence where you kind of need to dig into those energy systems a little more. So yeah, like I said, it's always worth kind of training those systems as well. So if we look again at the table, again, just kind of picture yourself where you're at with your climbing. I know for me, I primarily boulder, and these boulders take, sometimes it's less than 30 seconds, but usually it's kind of in this 30 seconds to 2-minute range. So if I'm training specifically on the wall for this, it's going to be more of those kind of power endurance exercises. But again, I'm also always going to be kind of training this phosphagen system. All right, and then when talking about the primary resistance training goal, so for endurance, typically, again, this is pretty local to the forearms. Really, if you're thinking about if you're getting tired or if you're getting pumped, it's because we're just repeatedly doing that grabbing motion with our fingers, which is going to fatigue the forearm. So like I said, that's pretty specific to climbing. Again, I might not have someone do 20 squats in a row because typically we're not really getting fatigued in our legs in that same sense. So ultimately for endurance, I think it's best trained on the wall and maybe not so much with strength or resistance training. For hypertrophy, it could be appropriate at times, like I talked about earlier, if you have a smaller frame, you just don't have that much muscle and you feel like you've strength trained and you've gotten everything as strong as you can, but you're just not as strong as you want to be, it could be worth putting on a little bit of muscle. And we're not talking about like a linebacker trying to put on a bunch of weight and muscle. You could add a few pounds and it could make a really big difference. I don't think we should be as scared of weight gain as we are, especially if it's to get stronger. And then strength-wise, I do find that I think strength is the most applicable to climbing because it's going to best prepare you for handling the different positions on the wall. So strength training has a really great history of injury prevention. So when you do find yourself in those unusual positions, which is pretty much impossible to avoid when you're climbing, you can't maintain everything perfectly. Just being confident that your body can handle those positions. And then we also are able to strengthen things that are really important for climbing. So that's going to be our shoulders, it's going to be those pulling muscles, just being able to exert force on the wall. And similarly, when we're talking about strength in the hips, your hips have a really great potential for generating power and holding different positions, holding tension. So I definitely find that strength has really good results for climbing. So again, we're thinking about this kind of 6 or fewer reps, 2 to 6 2 to 6 sets, and then we're doing a rest period of 2 to 5 minutes. And sometimes I do find that it's appropriate, especially for someone who's newer, to kind of go a little bit higher than 6 reps, because 6 reps is definitely pretty few reps. So you're going to have to be at a pretty high intensity for that. And if someone's pretty new to lifting, I do think it's fine to kind of bump up the rep numbers so they get more comfortable with it and can kind of build up to those higher intensities. But the biggest thing is just going to be this rest time. So even if we're doing more reps, but we're resting for 4 minutes, you're not going to get that same hypertrophy adaptation. And then we'll talk about periodization. So this is just my method. again, this is just my philosophy, it's my opinion, so take from it what you want. I like to undulate for strength. So that means I'm kind of staying in this kind of 10 or fewer reps, and I'm constantly varying through 10 or fewer reps from week to week. And again, I just find that that gets that variation. It challenges your neuromuscular system in different ways. It challenges your energy systems in different ways. So I, again, find that kind of undulating through those lower rep numbers is pretty appropriate for climbing. Like I said, higher reps may be appropriate for people who are untrained and just trying to get familiar. And I also like to program with supersets. So that just means pairing multiple exercises together without rest in between. And I generally do this between upper body and lower body exercises. So for example, I'll have someone do 8 squats, and then I'll have them do 8 pull-ups. And you know, you could take 10 or 15 seconds in between, but ultimately you have to take less rest at the end of that superset, because while you're doing those 8 pull-ups, your legs weren't doing anything, they were resting. So you can take off, you know, 30 seconds from that rest period, and you don't have to rest as long, and it's pretty time efficient like that. And then I like to program for between 6 to 8 weeks. And if we're talking about microcycles, I like to do for 8 weeks 2 4-week blocks. 6 weeks would be like 2 3-week blocks where you're kind of being intentional with that undulating program through those. You could do longer periods for sure. You could do 10 weeks, 12 weeks. Again, whatever it's going to lead up to that performance time the best for you. And then lastly, we're just going to talk about seasonality of climbing. So a lot of us climb year round. We have a lot of trouble pulling ourselves away from the wall to get some training in, but every other sport in the world does this. Most sports have an off season, most sports have a preseason, and most sports have an in-season where you're performing. So this is just a nice table to show where the priority for sport practice versus resistance training is. And so if you're in an off season, which for me would be like the dead of winter, like I'm not really climbing, I don't really have anything outside that I'm trying to go do. So in this, you could have pretty low sport priority and pretty high resistance training priority. So you're just focusing on getting really strong, getting pretty generally strong. With that, you can kind of ignore this. They do put an asterisk because it's just based on what your actual goal is, but you know, you could potentially do that more linear periodization where you start with hypertrophy and endurance. But like I said, I typically like to just undulate through strength. Then in the preseason, we're kind of doing half and half. We got half sport practice, half resistance training, which for me, again, this is kind of the season that I'm in. I'm gearing up for fall, so I have about 4 to 6 weeks left. So I do want to start incorporating more specific skill practice while I'm still resistance training. And then when you're in season, you can kind of put the resistance training in this maintenance phase, making sure you're maintaining where you got to in the preseason, but not necessarily trying to push past that much. So again, low priority, you're in maintenance, and we're doing a lot of specific sport practice. And then postseason could be variable just based on who you are. I know I don't really do anything else other than rock climb, but a lot of people have other interests. So for example, with winter, if you want to go ski, you want to go snowboard, you could definitely consider that kind of a postseason where you kind of just go and enjoy a different activity. And they kind of call it this active rest, where you're resting from the specifics of your sport. So even though you're being active with skiing or snowboarding, you're not taxing your fingers, you're not taxing your upper body as much. It's just different. It gets some variation in there. So I like to kind of zoom out, do that more macro cycle, plan out these seasons, plan out when I want to be in performance, and then you can kind of work backwards and make sure you have a training plan set up so that you're performing when you want to. Right, and with